Welcome everybody. Sorry for the confusion. You're in the private well class webinar today on Well Care 101. I'm with Katie Buckley, also here at the U of I at the State Water Survey, and thanks for attending. The private well class, as you hopefully are aware, if not, if this is your first time on one of our webinars, we're funded through the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, RCAP, and US EPA. And we work out of the State Water Survey, which in Illinois is a state agency or quasi-state agency, I guess, one of the scientific surveys similar to our State Geological Survey that most states have. And Illinois just is fortunate, in my opinion, to have an agency devoted just to water issues. So, yeah, welcome today. If you're here for CEs, continuing education credit through NEHA. If you're an EHP, the information you need to know is you can't take the same course twice in any given credentialing cycle, which is every 2 years. So as an example, if your credentialing cycle started on 6/1/21 and you take this today, you wouldn't be eligible to take the same course again, the Well Care 101, until 6/1/23. The first part of our webinar today is similar to the past webinars that are listed on the bottom right. But the second half of these webinars is really answering the questions that you all asked in advance. And because of that, they are different as far as being valuable to you as a well owner to look at. You can go to our, I'll show you at the end, you can go to our past webinars page and see all the past webinars. We record these, and they'll be available for viewing here a few days after the event. If you are here for CEs or Illinois LEHP credit, in the handouts section of your GoToWebinar tab, there's a care worksheet, a completion certificate of completion, and the agenda for today. You can also email us at info@privatewellclass.org to get a copy of the slide deck and completed NEHA forms after the fact, and Katie will manage that, and that's who you'll contact. So this is part of a national program implemented through RCAP to support private well owners. So RCAP is a unique organization. They provide help to not only private well owners, but small water and wastewater systems around the country. They're heavily engaged in the water business, if you will, and their part of this is they have staff in every state. They do well assessments. They provide boots on the ground support, help with in-person classes, workshops. And for our part, we run privatewellclass.org, which is a website that has links to a 10-lesson class. This is not the 10-lesson class. This is one of the webinars to support that. If you go to our webpage, and I'll show you that also later, you can sign up and it sends you a PDF once a week for 10 weeks. It's a lot more information than we can provide in this hour-and-a-half webinar. And I encourage everyone who is interested in understanding more about their well, how water gets into their well, common problems people have as well as treatment issues, to sign up for the class. It's all free, just like the webinar today is. One other thing I'll point out is that in your question box or chat box, you can ask questions during today's webinar. Katie's managing a Google document that we share, and at the end, we will go through those once we've completed the questions we're answering that came in advance. I think there were 80-some questions that came in prior to the webinar today. We obviously can't answer all of those, but we will answer a number of them after the canned part of this presentation is completed. So a little bit about RCAP. As I mentioned, they have staff in every state. They're really made up of 6 regional affiliate nonprofits. I'm in Illinois, so the Great Lakes Community Action Partnership covers Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, West Virginia, and Kentucky. There's 5 other nonprofits that work in the other parts of the country. They're a partnership with a national office in DC, which gets funding from groups like US EPA, HUD, USDA to support rural areas, private well owners, and small communities. If you're not familiar with these folks and you're a professional in the groundwater or private well industry, get a hold of us. We can get you in touch with the folks in your state. They're a great partner. They'll help solve problems for well owners. They can go out and do assessments of private wells individually, help you with workshops, provide speakers, a number of things. Or if you're just interested in having someone do a workshop in your local area, you can contact us and we can get you in contact with appropriate regional RCAP folks. So today what we're going to talk about is basically basics of well care, some of the basic information you really need to understand and what you should do to maintain your well. As I mentioned, we've received a lot of questions and we'll answer as many of those as we can today. I'm Steve Wilson. I'm a groundwater hydrologist here at the State Water Survey, and Katie Buckley's with me, our water resources outreach specialist. She's fielding these questions. She also helps with the CEUs, our CEs. Walt Kelly is the head of our groundwater section. He's a geochemist, and some of the questions are out of the scope of my expertise, certainly, and so we lean on folks like Walt to help us with some of those, to give us some of those answers. So I want to mention the Water Survey. I've been here a long time. I'm proud of where I work. It's a really great institution. We're allowed to do research, and we also help a lot of both well owners and communities, not only around the state of Illinois, but also in the country. We've been around for 126 years. Last year was our 125th anniversary. And we started out as an organization in the Department of Chemistry at the U of I who looked at the water quality problems that were emerging in the country, specifically typhoid and cholera. And we did a lot of work in the early 1900s, sampling wells, sampling water supplies, understanding what was causing those things, like what causes typhoid outbreaks in a given community. And, it really is the old well in some cases. And so we've evolved into an organization that does applied research, also public service. We house the state's well logs. We have a public service lab that provides water sample analysis for what it used to be just in Illinois, and now it's all over the country. I'm going to show you a couple examples from our archives, just because they're really interesting, and it shows what our history is like. And this is from it goes from 1873 to 1910, but this is about when we learned that treating our water, filtering it, adding chlorine, other things improved disease incidence. We were involved with a lot of communities in Illinois and around the country, even back then, with being instrumental in getting them to make those changes and adding treatment. And you can see the difference it makes when you add even filtering your water. In this case for Quincy, Illinois, really lowered the amount of typhoid they saw from those sources. These are glass plates, and that's where that other picture came from as well. I think this is a great slide just because it shows the level of detail you can get into when you're trying to do investigation of disease. This is a typhoid outbreak that happened in Rockford. There were about 130 cases. One of the parts of the investigation was to look at the dairy route of E. Erickson because they thought maybe his milk got tainted somehow. And you can see this glass plate is actually broken. I mean, it's from 1913, but we still have almost 1,400 of these glass plates in our files. And this shows, from July through September, the number of cases that were actually part of his route. And there's 130 cases, and the last one on September 10th was the 112th case. So obviously that was only a little piece of what was going on, but it's just an interesting introspective, if you will, or look back at the work that was done to try to figure out what caused typhoid, where it was coming in from, what happens when something gets tainted, all those sorts of issues. We did a lot of sampling. Most communities back in the 20s and before had a hand pump on a public well in their park. And this is an example of that, where people could just come in and fill up. There you see the old tin cup laying there just in front of the wooden base. People could just come up and take that cup and get a drink. Well, obviously not the most sanitary way to do things, which we know today. And we were also involved in helping communities determine where to drill, what kind of well they might need, all those things based on geology and other information. And this is a drill rig from 1922, cable tool rig, pretty we've come a long way, I guess is the way to say it. And Weldon's a small town in central Illinois, about 50 miles from us here. So what we're here to talk about today, though, is your well and private wells. And the thing to understand is they're not regulated in, and some states have rules for when they're first installed or when they transfer a property, but in general, they're not regulated once they've been approved and installed and put in service. So it's really up to you as a well owner to understand what you need to do to take care of your well, how to make sure it's safe to drink, and that you maintain your system. And you can't go by taste, odor, smell. Many contaminants, one of the most common contaminants in natural groundwater is arsenic. It's the 7th most common element in Earth's crust, but it's also colorless, odorless, and has no taste. So if you think your water tastes great because it's from groundwater, you have no idea how much arsenic might be in it unless you've tested your well. And that's the message that we provide over and over and over again, is that how important it is to test your well periodically to understand what could be in there. And so now I live in town. I pay $40 or $50 a month to be on my community water supply that supplies water to over 150,000 residents. That money goes to their maintenance infrastructure, making sure that that there's always water pressure, that the water's been tested every 3 months under the Safe Drinking Water Act to make sure it's safe. All those things that a community water supply does, you should be doing similar things as a private well owner. I'm not suggesting you test every 3 months, but you certainly should test, at least for coliform and nitrate, once a year, and for other constituents every 3 to 5 years, and I'll talk about that more. But I grew up on an old hand-dug well. My dad said the water was safe, even though it really wasn't. It was in a ravine. It was in a pasture with livestock. When it rained hard, our water was cloudy. When I left home to go to college and came back, I could no longer drink our water without getting sick. When I was a young kid, I got used to the water, and so it didn't bother me. But as soon as I left and started drinking city water, it was chlorinated. Those bacteria in my stomach that I was used to were gone, and I could no longer drink our well water. And that's a common story. It's just that simple. You might be used to it, but somebody comes to your house and they get sick because they drink your well water. It may be that there's bacteria in your well that you're okay with and have not made you sick because you drank it for the last 20 or 30 years, but it may not be safe for somebody else. And what I want to point out here, this last bullet, really the two biggest reasons for, and I say well problems, but I really mean water quality problems, are poor well construction. Because when any state has passed a rule to change or update their well construction code, any wells that are already in place don't have to bring it up to that code. They're grandfathered in. And so, there's still wells that are over 100 years old today. In many parts of the country, you find them every once in a while where the well still works fine, but it wasn't constructed to current construction code. And so I'll show you some examples, but it's really a problem, and that's what you need to understand is what's expected today when a well's drilled, the materials that are used, the grout that's used around the well, all those things versus how it was done in the past. And then the other thing is really just well owner lack of knowledge about how to take care of their well. We have folks who contact who are concerned when they hear about a boil order in their small community nearby. They'll call the water operator and ask, hey, does this mean my water's not safe to drink in my private well? Now, a boil order is issued because of a break in a water main in a community water supply. It has absolutely nothing to do with their well. And the well owner should already know that. Or there's a lot of other stories I could tell about that, but really it's important to take your responsibility as a well owner seriously, to understand how your well works, what your geology is, what's on your well log, and know what your water quality is by taking samples. And that really prepares you for when you do have a problem on how to address it. So for well considerations, there's a lot of things to look at when you put in a well, especially. Well depth, generally deeper is better, only from the standpoint that a deeper well, where the water is actually coming in the well from a deeper, from further down, is more protected from the surface. That doesn't always hold true. If you have bedrock at the surface, all the water in your well is coming from fractures. And I'll show that as one of the questions today that I'll answer gets into the issue of what type of well you have and how that matters as far as water quality. And so, in general, you don't want a well that's only 14 foot deep like the one I grew up on, where all of the water is really coming from shallow infiltration. And so anything at the surface is leaching down in and getting in the well. But having a deep well doesn't necessarily mean you're protected either, depending on what type of geology you have, what type of construction there is, all those things. Where you're at on a landscape, if you're down, we see cases all the time where somebody builds a house up on this nice little bluff above some stream, but there's no water up on the bluff, so their well is actually down in the bottomland next to the stream. Well, depending on how deep that is, how often that floods, that may be a really poor location to put a well. You don't want your well overtopped by water. Understanding the flow direction, meaning groundwater flows as part of the hydrologic cycle. So it infiltrates into the ground in recharge areas, and it discharges usually in a stream or a river or a lake or the ocean because of head differences, which is the pressure difference, the elevation of the water. So a well further up gradient is going to have a higher water level than a well further down gradient because water's flowing from the high well to the low well. And if you happen to know that flow direction, or your state resource agency, your DNR or GeoSurvey or Water Survey or whoever it might be, has information on major aquifer, if you're in a major aquifer, typically you know which way the water's flowing. And that tells you, you don't want your well just down gradient from a big feedlot or from some known source of contamination. And that's why that's important. And then just understanding the area around your well. What are you storing in your barn if you have a barn, or what's your neighbor doing in their yard if you have a shallow well? Just being aware of where even your neighbor's septic system might be versus where yours or the neighbor on the other side, or what kind of activities are going on around your well. Maybe you live near a gas station, really close. That's a consideration then for contamination from that source. So as far as correcting poor construction, Illinois passed a law in 1968 that required wells to be to meet a certain construction code, as well as for logs and permits to be filed. In some states that was in a lot of states that was in the 80s, and in some states it was as late as 2000. And so even after that, like the Illinois well code, it has changed over time. But as I mentioned before, existing wells are always grandfathered in. And so we still see wells in pits, which aren't allowed today. But a well was put in a pit in usually a cold climate so that the well could be deep enough that it wouldn't freeze at the top. And your pipes coming out of the top of the well. Well, now, in the 60s, they invented a pitless adapter that allows you to have a pipe all the way up to the surface. And then there's an elbow at about 4 feet or less that turns the water and runs it to your house. So we still see wells that were put in pits before the pitless adapter was invented, and those are really a risk because they can flood, they can be full of water, they harbor insects and other things. It's just a damp, nasty place that if your vent tube on your well cap isn't properly installed or doesn't have a screen anymore, things can get in your well, and those can cause bacteria and other problems. We also still see many hand dug wells like the one I grew up on. My grandpa hand dug ours in 1933. It was still in use when I left home for college. And my dad swore it was great water, even though it wasn't, just that simple. So those things provide two problems. One is not only the opportunity for surface contamination, but also they're a safety hazard. And I'll show you some examples of that. So as far as wells that aren't properly constructed. So the well in the upper left, and that picture comes from the Washington State Department of Ecology. They're the agency in Washington State that regulates drillers and well construction. They have a blog. This was on their blog. This woman had a little well house. There's a pump there at the surface, had a piece of cardboard or plywood, over top of the well. She stepped on it, it broke, she fell in, and it killed her. But if you look at this and look around the well, it looks like insulation that's fallen through along the walls. There's an old funnel there where they were putting oil in the pump. It's just all that stuff can fall in the well. It's not safe. And this was her water supply. The picture on the upper right is a well that actually wasn't being used anymore, but it's an old brick-lined well that a farmer had just put a piece of concrete tile in the upper 4 feet so that you were aware of it, but it only went up about a foot above grade. So somebody's goat got loose and stuck their nose in there and was curious, and that's the way it looked. And you know, this is an extreme example, and again, this well wasn't being used at the time, but we've pulled rats, rabbits, mice, snakes, you name it, out of wells, frogs, where people don't have their well sealed properly. Just like the picture on the bottom, this was an active well on a farm. It's a large hand dug well. It's on the side of a hill. You can see up there that was a field. Every other year, probably in corn. All the runoff is down towards the well. The actual area that the well is in is a pasture. The reason there's mud on the lower right side is because cattle, there's a watering trough not too far from off the picture, and cattle are using those posts to scratch and do everything else. And you know, this is an old brick-lined well that's covered with some 2x10s and 2x8s with some pieces of tin and some concrete blocks and rocks to hold it all down. You know, rats, snakes, larger animals can get in there. In a dry time, if they smell water, they're going to try to get in there. And you know, it's just not a safe water supply. So what can you do if you have a well that's not up to code? Bring it up to code if you can. You know, and sometimes that can be expensive, but you need to do whatever you can to make sure that nothing can get in your well, that it's safe, and that it's not providing a source of contamination, because that's what will happen. So if it's in a pit, extend the pipe up above land surface, fill that in with clay or grout, so that you don't have a pit anymore, and install a pitless. But you can talk to your well authority, or county or contractor, extension, or your local health department, and all of them will have good advice for you about how to improve your well if it's not sealed properly and it isn't properly constructed. Because as I mentioned earlier, poor well construction is the cause of many, many water quality issues in wells, and that's the first place to start. The same thing with abandoned wells. Well logs weren't required in most states until the 60s, and so what that leads to is there's many, many undocumented wells out there than we have on file. Case in point, in Illinois, there's about 750,000 to 800,000 wells in use today in Illinois, and we have records for about 450,000 of those wells in our files. So not only do we not have the 350,000 wells that are in use, we don't have logs for, but there's many more wells that are no longer used that need to be properly abandoned that we don't have on file. So they're really like a pit. People throw stuff down them. They just don't realize that it could be a conduit directly to an aquifer. And so if you're throwing things in there, old cans or whatever, it could be causing contamination of the aquifer. Case in point, we helped with a well sealing demonstration of an old dug well, and when they pulled the concrete cap off that well, it had been a hand pump, so there was about a 3-inch hole in the concrete cap for where the hand pump had went in. And this is a well that's was probably 80, 90 years old, but the owner of the house, it was right next to his house, had been using that 3-inch hole as his ashtray. So when we pulled the concrete pad off of that, you could see about 10,000 cigarette butts down in the well. It was only 22 foot deep. And that, that's just not a good idea. That's the best way to say that. So if you have an abandoned well, you really need to properly, an old unused well, you need to properly abandon it so that you aren't responsible for it, especially if you're the owner of the property. Even if somebody trespasses and wanders onto your property, they fall in that and get killed or get hurt, it's likely going to come back on you for having that not filled like it should be. And it can also contaminate an aquifer. We've seen cases where people are dumping stuff in an old well and it ends up contaminating a number of wells in an area just because they don't understand that that well casing is a conduit directly to the aquifer. Just here's some examples of some abandoned wells. and they were, just found, the Sheldon Man falls 45 feet. That's also from the Washington Department of Ecology. And this guy was in his backyard, and there was an old well, and he fell in. He walked away from that. And, it happens more often than people realize. These newspaper clippings are all from the 90s, and 3 of those are from Illinois, but the third one down is Jessica McClure from Texas. Any of you old enough to remember that being carried live on CNN? It took 18 hours or 22 hours, something like that, to dig her out of a well she fell in. It was only, I think it was an 8 or 10-inch well. It was pretty small. I guess it's probably a little bigger than that. But she was just an 18-month-old baby. She's grown today and has 3 kids of her own. But people found her and were able to dig her out. It was carried live on CNN. It was interesting. It had the whole nation mesmerized for a day and a half, as I recall. So basic well care, best management practices, BMPs. One thing I'll point out is if you don't have the wherewithal to understand all the things related to your well, and you're just trying to do something because it's going to save you money, many times you're going to regret it. It's better to use a licensed well driller, pump installer, or contractor. I'm not here to advertise for any drilling company, but if, and there are folks who have the wherewithal to manage their well and take care of it themselves, and that's great, but most well owners I run across do not. And so if it's something significant with your well and you're going to try to learn on the fly, you're taking a risk with your family's water quality and the water they're drinking. And it's usually better just to take care of it. You treat your well like an investment you would for your car or your house. You're not just going to let it go and go into disrepair. You're not going to not understand the water quality because you need to, all those things. If you want to learn more about your well, every state but 2 have well construction code. And it's true, there's still 2 states that do not, Alaska and Pennsylvania. But you can look at some other state to see what best practices are. And I know in Pennsylvania, for instance, some of the counties or local watershed districts have taken it upon themselves to create their own rules, since the state won't enact any, to help protect their aquifers from poor wells that aren't properly drilled or properly constructed, that aren't grouted properly, or things like that. It can be a risk for a lot of people, not just the people who are putting the well in. And so I encourage you to look up your handbook or your rules. They're available online in most states, and they'll tell you what materials you can use, all those things. As far as at the well site, again, this is I use this picture even though it's province of Manitoba, because this is a well guide they had, and that's just a really nice looking well. I mean, it's newly constructed. It's the only thing I would do differently here is I would probably mound up the ground around the well so that when it rains, water's running away from it instead of able to sit right around the well casing. Even if this is grouted properly, which, grout is material, clay or cement, that is more impermeable, it doesn't allow water to move through it, that you place around the well casing in the borehole. So, when you drill a well, let's say you're going to drill, put in a 5-inch casing, you might drill a 7 3/8 well a bore with a weld rig. That might be the size of the bit. So now you've got a hole that's 7 3/8, and you're going to put a 5-inch casing in it. The area between that is just an open hole, and so you fill that with grout. Most states require what kind of grout you can use and how much grout you need to use, depending on where the aquifers are, and so that nothing can run down the outside of the well casing and get into the aquifer. So as far as basic well care, if your cap has a screen, has a vent, make sure it has a screen on the vent. That's where critters can get in. And on this picture, that extra smaller pipe is for all the electrical equipment. There's just wires in that. So it's got a pitless inside of it, I'm sure. Make sure your well casing's elevated. Most states have a requirement, either 12 or 18 inches. But I've seen wells that are in floodplains that might stick up 9, 10 feet. There's one on the way. I grew up about 80 miles from where I live now, and driving back over to see my mom, there's a hog farm that put in 2 large wells along a stream where there's sand and they can get a lot of good water. And both of those casings are up 8.5 feet, I think, above the ground, and that's so when it floods, the top of the well doesn't get overtopped, and that's why that's an important thing. Or if your well gets put in a low area where it can flood and pond, you need to make sure your well's properly sealed and that there are no joints where water could leak in. Your well also needs to be accessible. The worst case I ran across was a gentleman who wanted to put a garage near his house, right where his well is. So instead of understanding what a problem that might be, he basically cut the well off below grade, ran the pipes underground, and then put I think it was a 25 by 40 garage concrete pad right on top of his well. And this happened to be not a well that has a pump at the surface, but it had a pump installed in it. And, that's really not a very smart thing, because if your pump fails, now you need a whole new well, or you're going to be digging a hole through your concrete floor, and there's no way to get a rig over that unless you move the building. But you see in the news every once in a while a story of where someone finds a well underneath an addition to their house, or in their basement is the well they have. We've seen wells that are actually in somebody's kitchen. They built their house around it. And these are very old homes. It's not done today, obviously. So, but it's, they're still out there and they're still being used. I mentioned the annulus. Make sure it's the slopes. The annulus is sealed properly with clay grout or cement, and the ground is sloped away from the well. And then inspect for potential sources means really look around what's around the well. I think I show an example of all the things that can affect a well. Yeah. So I use Minnesota Department of Health a lot because they have a very robust private well program. They do a lot to support the well owners in their state, and they have staff and regional offices around the state that actually are there to be support for well owners. And so this is from their well construction code, and these are the required setback distances from a well that's installed. So I show this one because it's a great example of all the things you might not consider being an issue, but that you really need to consider if you're going to put stuff near your well. Like, we see where people tie their dog up or their pet up to the wellhead just because it's someplace they can tie them to. Well, if you have a really shallow well and you're letting your dog do its business right around there, if it's going on like that for very long, if they're long enough that they've worn a bare spot in the ground, that's probably an issue. So, even from a house or building, 3 feet, that's in their code. That's really just so that a rig can pull up over the well and put a tower up and pull a pump if it needs to. And people sometimes don't think about all those things, but there's a lot to consider, including graves, especially in some rural areas. You have old farmsteads that have a family plot, things like that. But it's just, it's really common sense when you think about it, that you should keep things away from your well so that you're not introducing anything that could potentially infiltrate into the ground near your well and get into your water supply. So the other thing to consider is septic systems. Most private wells also have, those homes have septic systems, not always. We see some both ways. We see once in a while we'll see a private well, a bunch of private wells in this very small community, and they have a centralized wastewater system. More often though, it's the other way. We see centralized wastewater and but not centralized wastewater, and they have septic systems for their wastewater. Just to talk a little bit about this, I'm not going to go too much today. Every July we do a septic webinar where we have a septic expert on the call who can answer questions, and we spend a lot more detail going into things that you should consider there. I encourage you to look up that webinar on our website. Again, it's free, and you can watch the whole thing. And the last one was in July of 2021. But this is a 2-compartment tank, just so you understand what your septic tank and septic field look like. This is a traditional system. So the water coming from your house goes into the first side of the tank. The solids fall out or they float. You can see those there. And then that settles all that stuff out. There's bacteria from our bodies that naturally make a septic tank work. It breaks down all that material. And then as it fills up, it goes into the second tank where it can further, the bacteria can continue to work on any material that's there, basically cleaning the water in a way, not completely, but then it can drain out into your septic field, which is the perforated pipe to the right. Usually those are installed with gravel around them so that the water can freely move. And when it gets into the soil, then bacteria break everything down into its natural state. So it's a great natural gravity-fed system. It doesn't need any additives or anything else done to it as long as you maintain it, and it'll function for a long time. We've run into septic systems that are over 100 years old. But we also run into people a lot who say, well, I've never had to pump my septic tank. And my answer to them is just wait, because eventually you're going to clog it, or you're going to clog your septic field, or it's going to back up into your house, and then you're going to have to dig the entire thing out and start over, or find a new spot, because it won't function anymore, especially if you've clogged the drain field or the soil absorption field as it's listed here. There's no fixing that. It's just clogged up, and that's because you didn't pump your tank and get rid of the solids when you need to. So on a to-do list for septic tank maintenance, and that's one is to maintain the area around your tank and know where it's at. When we do our septic webinar in July, we also give people a chance to ask questions in advance. And I bet I've had 20 questions about how do I find my septic tank. So, that tells me you haven't pumped it, you don't even know where it's at, you don't know where the opening is. You need to know where the inspection port is. And once you find those things, or the next question from that is, well, how do I find it? You can use, there's a number of ways. I would have a contractor come out and find it for you, but you should be able to get an idea based on where it goes out your house in the basement, assuming you have one. But you also want to do the right thing as far as, the perforated pipe especially. You don't want to have trees or other material near your septic field. If you have concrete or asphalt, or you're driving heavy equipment or even cars over it, you're compacting the soil. That doesn't let the water flow as freely, and it's not going to work properly. But trees are really a problem because the roots search out water, and especially nutrient-enriched water like from a septic tank. And so once those roots get in those openings, the perforated pipe, they're free to grow, and they cause all kinds of havoc. And so you want to keep the area around your septic field in grass if you can. You should also try to reduce the flow. The bacteria that's in a septic tank works because they have time to break down the material that comes in, whether that's vegetables or waste or whatever. But if you're flooding that all the time with a whirlpool or sump pumps or even a softener backwash, then you're not giving the bacteria time to work. And so it's not that you have to conserve water per se, but you shouldn't have large flows going into it regularly, like the ones that are mentioned here, just because it doesn't give the bacteria time to break down that material before it goes into the septic field. And you'll have more, and it also doesn't allow the bacteria to grow as well. So the more bacteria in there, the better. And you should only put wastewater into your septic system. So if you have a garbage disposal, the rule of thumb is you have the time that you need to pump your tank. So usually how often you pump your tank is based on the number of people in the home and the size of the tank. And there's charts available for that. You can find that information in our July webinar, actually. But if you have a garbage disposal, bacteria can't break down like, the solids from carrots and other vegetables, potato skins. It takes too long. So that stuff ends up as a sludge in the bottom of your tank. So if you have a garbage disposal, it really increases the solids in your tank significantly. And so that's an issue. The other thing is obviously no man-made stuff. Don't put paint, or your child was sick and was on amoxicillin. Well, what is amoxicillin? It kills bacteria, right? And so you don't want to put that in your septic tank where you're trying to grow bacteria to handle all the waste that's coming in. So you should inspect your tank regularly so you can measure the solids, or have a contractor do that. And over time, if you have no idea how often you should pump your tank or don't know the size of your tank, have someone come out and inspect it, measure the solids, and then pump it out. So then have them come back a year later or 2 years later, and just to measure the solids. And from that, you can get an idea how quickly it's filling up. Usually you pump a tank when it's 60 to 70% full. And so you may determine after the 2 years that you've got 2 more years to go, or 6 more years to go, or maybe it's time right then. but you need to take care of that. You don't want solids to build up in your tank, is the bottom line. And so pumping on a regular schedule is really one of the most important things you can do. Now, I'm not a septic expert, which is why I bring somebody on our webinars, but EPA has a website, just it's epa.gov/septic. And there's a whole program. They have Septic Smart Week every September. You may have heard of that if you follow any organizations that deal with water quality. It's a pretty big program. A lot of folks, like we're on social media, we put out resources, we try to help folks understand that it's an important thing to understand. About 1 in 5 homes in the country are on septic systems, and that number is growing because more and more communities, as they expand, aren't extending their centralized wastewater treatment. Instead, they're building either individual septic tanks for homes, or they're putting in small cluster systems that maybe operate for one neighborhood only that have to be pumped. And so the world's kind of changing on the wastewater side, but you can find out all that information on the EPA's septic page. There's information that'll really help you understand how to take care of your tank, all those things. And I'm just going to go through a few of these slides quickly, but there's under Learn About Septic Systems, there's a lot of information on overview of systems. There's actually more resources available for septic systems than there are for private wells because of the water quality considerations and the fact that sometimes these septic systems end up reaching either field tile or outlets that get into our streams and rivers and cause environmental problems. How it works, you can learn, again, I'm just going to skip through this pretty fast, but everything you want to know about a septic system you can find on this page, as well as how to help out even with Septic Smart Week and things like that. This shows an example of how water flows, even if your septic system is on the other side of your home and it meets the setback it's supposed to. I'm going to show you at the bottom of this page how that can happen. And again, I talked about groundwater flow earlier. Well, in this case, the septic system was put in on the upgradient side of the flow for the groundwater flow direction. So the well is off to the right and it's pumping water from the aquifer, which is the green. And the septic drain field, number 3 there, is the water slowly percolating through the soil. It's being broken down, but maybe not all the way. And once it reaches the groundwater saturated zone, it starts moving with the groundwater flow, which is towards some discharge point, and it's going right to the well. And so understanding all these things is really important, and that's why managing your septic tank is also an important thing to do, because you don't want to have any problems with that. And if you ever have a septic problem, if it backs up in your house, that's something you don't want to experience. The other thing that can happen is the tank clogs, and all of a sudden you'll have an area around your drain field or somewhere between your drain field and your septic tank that's really green and moist all the time, and eventually that's also going to start causing, it's an odor problem. If you have an advanced system, in some parts of the country, or if you're in an area that's got vulnerable geology, you may have to have an advanced treatment system. There's a lot of good information here about those technologies, like they maybe remove nitrate, or you're basically treating your water like a water treatment plant would, or wastewater treatment plant would, to make it safe to discharge. And so what a wastewater plant for a community has to do is they have a permit to discharge their wastewater into a local water body, a river, stream, or whatever. But they can't discharge that until they've treated it such that it meets certain requirements. It can't have too much BOD. It can't have any kind of other contaminants. It's got to have those things removed. Well, these advanced on-site technology products it mentions here are basically very small wastewater treatment plants that help remove some of those things, because there is no soil or not enough of it to actually do the remediation you need for the stuff that would typically go into your drain field. And so there's a lot of good information there. There's also a ton of webcasts that they've done on different programs in local areas, or just how it's important and why you want to use a certified person, all those things. You can learn a lot about your septic tank by going through all this information. So lastly, testing. So you should test your well annually, And so annually is for nitrate and coliform bacteria. And then anytime the well's been opened, or if you notice anything different about it, taste, odor, color, it's just really important to always know what your water quality is. And when you test your well annually, it's really to test it, you're testing for well integrity is all you're doing. If someone says, well, we tested for nitrate and coliform and our well was fine, so it's safe, that's not true. You don't know if it's safe. It might be, but you test for coliform and nitrate. One, if you're an adult, nitrate's not regulated as a health concern for adults. It's for babies, all right, under 6 months old. And coliform bacteria doesn't cause health effects. It's an indicator bacteria. If you have coliform, that means there's a pathway into your well, and it's likely that other things could also be in there, like E. coli or some other bacteria that are harmful. And so you test for coliform and nitrate, because if nitrate's at elevated levels, it's so ubiquitous in the environment, that means that near surface water is getting in your well. Or if you have coliform, it means that there's an opening in your well, some kind of bridge or break in your well, or you're getting shallow water that has coliform bacteria in it, like coming from your septic or a feedlot. And so you're really testing for coliform and nitrate annually to indicate that your well's properly protected from surface contaminants. That's it. So what we recommend is it's really different. Everybody's situation is really different. How deep your well is, the formation your water's coming from, the type of well you have, if there are known contaminants in your area like arsenic or radon or whatever. And so you need to ask. One of the things you need to do is ask your county or state health department or local health department if you're out east for advice on what to test for. They should be able to tell you if there's any local contaminants of concern, and so should other folks. Your state resource agency like your DNR or scientific survey. If there's, we know where there's arsenic in Illinois, for instance. We've done a lot of research looking at why and why it's in some water, not others, all those things. But even, your neighbors may know, or the folks who keep the drill records for the state, be inquisitive and ask. Your co-op extension, if they don't know, they can find out. They're good at that. That's their outreach portion of they're really useful folks. And then again, sample for coliform and nitrate annually because they indicate a pathway into your well. So I'm going to show you a couple things real quick. So Massachusetts DEP has this website where you can type in your address and it'll tell you if you're at risk for arsenic or uranium in bedrock wells. So if you have a bedrock well and you're in Massachusetts, you can go to this website, type in your address, and it's going to say, yes, we know there's arsenic in this area, or yes, we know there's uranium in this area, or yes, there's both, and why you need to test for those. It's just a service. It's from all the work that they've done to understand the geology and water quality of their source water. And so it's really a useful tool. So I'm just going to show a couple examples, but the idea here is you need to get online and look things up first and find out if there's actually a problem in your area. You might be surprised. There may be nothing, or there may be a very common. We know in Tazewell County, Illinois, there's a lot of arsenic in the Mahomet Aquifer. If that's the aquifer you're getting your water from and you're in Tazewell County, then you should know to test for arsenic. It's that simple. And here's a great example of why you need to do that. This is Rhode Island, which is a very small state. It's 30 by 40 miles, I think. All the little small dots that are all over the place on there are where there used to be orchards. And they put these on here because for so long, orchards used arsenic as a pesticide, that all of these areas have soil contamination with arsenic. It doesn't mean that there's groundwater contamination, but in many of those cases it will be, because eventually it's going to leach through the unsaturated zone and reach the aquifer or reach the water table. And so if you're in an area where there was an orchard, they're telling you should test for arsenic, and it could be pretty high. The big splotch that's in the middle third is beryllium, and that's the reason I show this slide. When I found this on Rhode Island's website, probably in 2013, I had no idea that beryllium was even a regulated contaminant. So the Safe Drinking Water Act, which every community has to test regularly for all the contaminants listed under the Safe Drinking Water Act to make sure the water they're putting out to their residents is safe. The Safe Drinking Water Act does not apply to private wells. So if you're a private well owner, that's on you. I would never suggest somebody test for beryllium until I found this. And I would still only suggest it in an area where you know it exists, because it's a very uncommon constituent in my experience. But if you're in this area of Rhode Island, you should test for beryllium because it does have health effects. And if you're drinking higher levels of beryllium, it could just affect your health. It's that simple. So this is why you need to look and be investigative and try to find information before you decide what you're going to sample for, because you want to know, and you should be in the know, right? You're the owner of a very small water system. You really need to take the initiative to understand how your well works, the geology, how deep it is, all those things, and understand if there's any risks that you should be aware of. One of the better tools out there is from Wisconsin DNR. They funded the Center for Watershed Science and Education at Wisconsin Stevens Point to take their water quality data for private wells that they had and develop this GIS tool. I went up in the upper right corner and told it to display arsenic by county. And so what I'm seeing is the results of that. I took a screenshot, and you can see that one county near Duluth shows there's none detected. Where the counties are clear means they have no samples. But in the green, it means it's 5 milligrams or less, or micrograms per liter or less. The health standard in the Safe Drinking Water Act for arsenic is 10. So a community water supply has to keep their arsenic level that they're sending out through their water system at below 10 parts per billion. So you can see 3 counties there near Green Bay are in red. That means the average private well sample in that area was 21 or higher. And there are just areas where the geology supports more arsenic release into groundwater. And we have a couple of counties like that in Illinois. I mentioned Tazewell County, and it's good to be aware. If I'm going to move to Green Bay and buy a house out in the country that has a well, I know that I'm going to test that well for arsenic before I move in. And it doesn't mean that every well is contaminated with arsenic. It really can be spotty, but it's something to be aware of and something you should test for. Now, this picture, I've used it for at least 4 or 5 years. I was on the site the other day, and this map's actually changed. One, there aren't any clear counties anymore, at least the search I did. And this has moved as they've collected more data. There's different colors in some of the different counties. And so, but if you're in Wisconsin, I would look this up before I did any sampling of my well, just to see if there's any constituents of concern that they already know are in your area. And so it's a great tool. I expect more states to go to this eventually. It's just, knowing that there's water quality problems with a well is also a real estate issue because of property values. And so we do have states that require testing at property transfer. And what they found is that actually just increases everyone's due diligence at either adding treatment if they need it, or at least everyone being aware before a property is sold what their water quality issues are. And so it's really a win-win for everybody, because it's better to be informed, and the more data we have and the more communication there is, somebody's not upset later. And a great example of that, in Macon County, Illinois, I had a well owner call me, mad as a wet hen, blaming me for her not knowing she had arsenic in her well. She'd bought the property 5 years before. She has 4 kids, I think 4 kids, it might have been 5 kids. They only tested it for coliform and nitrate. That's all that was required for the sale. And so she assumed her water was safe. And she'd read in the paper there was some arsenic in the area. Like 5 years later, sampled her well. She had 150 ppb of arsenic, which is 15 times the limit that's allowed for a public water supply. It doesn't mean that you're definitely going to get cancer, but it sure means that you're at increased risk for it if you're drinking that water every day. So she wanted to know why the state wasn't doing more to protect her. And I told her what I tell everybody, and I'm telling you today, it's buyer beware. You should be ahead of the game. You should know these things in advance. If you're going to it doesn't mean you shouldn't buy a home with a well. It very well could be the water's fine. But you need to do all of your due diligence. Test it, make sure if there's treatment needed that you work that out with the seller. And that's what we tell sellers. You're better off finding out in advance if you have a water quality problem and remediating it, so that whenever somebody comes to look at your home that you want to sell, you can say you've been proactive, that you understand what the situation is and you've dealt with it. That's a lot better than trying to hide it and then regretting it later. So here's what we suggest. Again, coliform nitrate annually, and then a list of constituents, inorganics, and metals that really give you an idea of what your water quality is overall. And again, if you have copper piping, you want to test for copper. If you have galvanized piping, you want to test for zinc and cadmium. And you know, we recommend everyone test for lead. Some labs don't always do that. You have to add that on. If you have PEX or PVC plastic pipe and throughout your entire home with no fittings that might be brass or copper or whatever, then you probably don't need to test for those things, but that's very rare. And so, you know, determining, even knowing the pH and the alkalinity and some of those things help you understand if your water might be corrosive, or help, you know, someone who's a water quality expert can tell you if your water's corrosive. And that's what you really need to know, because, you know, lead isn't a problem in groundwater. Lead is a problem in your home plumbing. And so if you have copper pipes with lead solder, or you have lead pipes or galvanized pipes, that's where the risk is. And again, it doesn't mean that you're actually leaching lead if you have lead pipes. It depends on the water quality. It may be that your pipes are actually forming scale on the inside, because instead of being corrosive, they're actually the other side of that. They're scale forming. But you have to know and understand it to understand whether or not you might have a problem. And the best way to start any of these things is to sample, and then you know what you're working with for your water quality. And again, don't just use our list. Get advice from local, county, state health department, others. Look online at your state resource agency, whoever makes water quality maps in your state, or maps aquifers in your state. Most of the time, those same folks also know something about the water quality. You know, we do that work here in Illinois, along with our state geological survey. As far as getting it analyzed, you know, we recommend using a state accredited lab. You don't have to, and sometimes it's cheaper not to, but if you're using an accredited lab, that means they've gone through the NELAC certification, so they meet all the criteria to be able to you know, to show that they're able to do good work, and that they're using the proper techniques, and that they've, you know, been given blind samples and been able to tell what's in those properly. So you know they're a reputable lab. It doesn't mean that there aren't labs that aren't accredited that do good work. Some have separate purposes. They're only for their own use, or they're only for not compliance related work. And so, and that, you know, that would be our lab here. And we use our lab, and they use all the right techniques and all those things. We're just not accredited, although that's changing. We are going to be. But yeah, you want to use an accredited lab, just because for me, that's the best advice to give you as a well owner. That way, there's no question about whether or not the sample is actually valid. So, and even accredited labs make mistakes. So, as far as picking a lab, you know, you might call a lab and they're like, well, we don't do private well samples. Some don't. They only do samples for communities for their certification, you know, for compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act. But you find a lab that does do that, they should be able to tell you the entire process, walk you through it, send you the bottles, tell you if you need to do anything, keep it on ice, how quickly you need to get it back, all those things. They should be able to answer your questions until you're satisfied. If you call a lab and they're like, well, we don't know what you should test for, you need to tell us, say thank you, and then go find a different lab. What I tell labs is that they need to have somebody on staff who understands private well issues and needs. If you don't have that and can't talk to a well owner intelligently, I tell well owners not to use you. And I've preached that message for a number of years, because it's really important. When you're a well owner, you're looking at the lab as the expert. And if they don't have that ability, then I'd find one that does, because they are out there. And again, a lab should be able to provide you the bottles and everything else you need, and instructions, all that stuff. As far as interpreting results, there are websites out there where you can type in the data and it'll tell you those things. But my advice, even if you want to use one of those, and I'm actually going to show you an example of one that's really good, is you should still take them to your local health department and ask them for a qualified answer. What does this mean? Because you want to talk to someone who is in the health field that understands your health, or you can even take it to your doctor. But if they find, you know, one of the things I recommend is if they do find something in your well, I would resample, especially if it's really drastic and it doesn't make sense that you would have that when nobody else does, or it's 10 times what it should have been, or 100 times what it should have been. Sometimes it's worth collecting a sample to see if the lab did make an error just for that constituent. Not always, but if it's not a bad idea. And if you test for coliform bacteria, then and it's positive, then I do an E. coli test. And until you get your E. coli results back, or you have a chance to chlorinate your well, I would boil your water and only drink and cook with water that's been boiled. And if, even if it's just coliform bacteria, you're probably going to want to chlorinate your well. And hopefully it's a one-time instance that once you shot chlorinate it, then a sample will come back negative so that you can drink your water again. But even after you've shot chlorinated it, don't drink it until you take a water sample and have it analyzed and you're sure it actually worked. Sometimes there's instances, and I'll go through this in one of the questions, there are certainly instances where it doesn't work. Maybe there's layers of biofilm buildup on some of the pipe. You can't see that, you don't know where it's at in your system, but it's there. In that case, you could still have bacteria showing up even after you've shot chlorinate once or maybe even twice. So I mentioned there's a tool online. The one I recommend using is called the Be Well Informed Guide from the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. They built this with CDC money, I don't know, 6 or 8 years ago probably. It's really cool. Down at the bottom in the green, it says enter your water test results. They built this for people in New Hampshire, which have a lot of water quality issues, especially related to arsenic. But anyone can use it. It's free and publicly available online. So you click on the green button there, and it takes you to a page where you can enter your results. Where it says New Hampshire town or city at the top gray box on the right, you can put in anonymous. If you're actually in New Hampshire, I would recommend that you actually put in your town that you live in or near. That helps them understand where these water quality issues might be in their state. And for the service they're providing you, that's a small thing to ask. They're not asking for your address and your phone number, just what town you're from. And so if you're from one of the towns in New Hampshire, please fill that out properly. So I put in 15 micrograms per liter, which the standard is 10 micrograms per liter. The nice thing about this tool is most lab results come back with a set of units that are specific for the lab. There's a standard, a thing they should use, but it used to be that if your results came back in anything but milligrams per liter, you had to convert it yourself. And that's a real problem. All of us struggle with math, me included. And I know I asked this question on our private well class in the pre-test that people take when they first sign up. I asked them to convert units. Just a simple thing, your arsenic is at 0.1 ppb or 0.1 ppm, how many micrograms per liter is that? Only 27% of all the respondents, thousands, have got that right. And so this, on the other hand, allows you to put it in whatever units your lab results are in. So if they'd have put it in milligrams per liter, it would have been 0.015, but I could have put 0.015 and then clicked on mg per liter instead of micrograms per liter. Or if it was in ppm or ppb, those are equivalent. They're not exactly the same, but for our purposes and for the levels we're working at, they are the same. Milligrams per liter is the same as parts per million. Micrograms per liter is the same as parts per billion. And so you can do that with all of these. I just put in the 15, and that tells me, oh, red X. The standard is 0.015 milligrams per liter. That's the legal description in the Safe Drinking Water Act. And the standard's 0.01, which is 10 micrograms per liter. So the nice thing about this tool is it also then tells you, here's the type of treatment that'll work on this down below there. Point of use, absorptive media, or point of use RO. And so these are what they recommend as far as common ways to treat it. There are other methods. Distillation works for arsenic, and I answered that question too. We had a number of questions about treating for specific constituents, so I'm going to give you an overview of that when we get to that point of the questions. And then further down, there's information on if you're going to add treatment. It talks about, down in the last big gray box, it talks about NSF ANSI standard 53 and 58. That's a really important designation. So NSF stands for National Sanitation Foundation. They're a third-party certifier. So treatment companies take their equipment to NSF, to the Water Quality Association, or to Underwriters Lab, UL, and then they ask them to test it. we want this treatment device to be certified for removal of arsenic under standard 53. So then they test it to a set of criteria with spiked water. And if it actually does what it's supposed to do and it takes out the arsenic down to a certain level, then it will get that certification. And when you go out online and look for a treatment device, you want to make sure it's been through that process, even though it will be more expensive than some that are listed that haven't been. But if it hasn't been, you have no guarantee that it actually remove the arsenic. And that's just buyer beware again. There's a lot of equipment out there that claim to do things. You know, you need to understand what's got science behind it and what doesn't. And you know, the two methods they listed were either point of use absorptive media, which is NSF standard 53, or NSF ANSI standard 53, or RO, which is NSF standard 58. And that standard 58, like for RO, lists all the things that RO will remove. And for any kind of treatment, you know, RO removes a lot more than arsenic. And what you can expect from that device if you buy it. Okay, so again, these are tools and they're only a guide. Sometimes you have some really unique water quality that can't be explained necessarily by a typical sample result. And so you should always take your results to a qualified health person. And again, because they're health professionals and they want to make sure your water is safe to drink because they care about your health, right? And so that's who you should lean on when it comes down to protecting your family's health. So they can't tell you to stop drinking your water or condemn your well. They can only recommend it. So that is a true statement in 99% of the country. What I've learned over time is that in some areas, like where they have local health districts in states like Massachusetts, Connecticut, you know, in some of those areas where local health districts can give themselves to the authority to actually condemn your well. You can't in Illinois. No health department in Illinois can condemn your well. But there are a few very local jurisdictions out east where they maybe can. And I know that's a concern. But my advice is you should go to a health professional in your local health department and ask them for advice. If you're concerned about that specific issue, then call them first and ask them what their rules are, what authority they have. And if they can actually condemn your well, you know, that's a decision you have to make for yourself. It's still, you need to get an answer. Then maybe go to your doctor. Or someone in a different area, you know, who may be a health professional or may understand water quality, but you need to take it to someone who's qualified to give you good advice. As far as treatment, you know, I'm gonna show this example of, but in our class, lesson 10 is all about treatment and treatment devices. And these two figures both come from that and explain how these processes work. And the message for today is that no matter what kind of treatment you have, whether it's a filter, a softener, RO, whole house something, you know, an aerator, you know, whatever it might be, you have to maintain it. And if it has a replacement schedule for a cartridge or a filter, you have to actually do that when it says to. If not, like at a cartridge filter for, you know, it can clog and really reduce water flow in your home and cause all kinds of other problems. It can become a source of bacteria because things will eventually grow on it if you don't replace it. So the message really is whatever treatment you have, be prepared to actually take care of it. I actually had one of the regional folks in Minnesota suggest early on in our class that we not talk about treatment at all, because in his experience, he goes into more homes where they've had water quality issues and finds that there's a treatment device that hasn't been taken care of in years, and it's the source of the water quality problem. So I don't know, I can't make this statement strong enough. If you have any kind of treatment devices, take care of them. That's part of the deal if you're going to do that. So a little bit about our class real quick. This is the front page. It's privatewellclass.org. You can click on Take Our Free Class, and it'll take you to a page where you can sign up. We also have podcasts and a lot of videos because we record all of our webinars as well. So when you click on that and you go to this page, it'll give you a chance to sign up. We just ask for your email address, your first name, and the state you live in. And the bottom one there is really just so that we can show to RCAP and EPA that we're reaching folks all over the country. We've had over 9,000 people take our class. We've had close to 25,000 people take our webinars. It's really worth going through the 10 lessons. Again, they're mailed to you once a week. They're a PDF. You're on your own to read it. You're on your own to follow up. We won't contact you and ask you if, on page 4, the third paragraph, what was this, whatever. It's self-paced, and it's meant to be information you can use. But what I can tell you in my experience working here for over 30 years, well owners mostly call me when they have a problem. They don't be proactive and try to understand their geology, their well log, their water quality, any of that in advance. They take it for granted. And then when they have a problem, it's usually too late. They could have done some maintenance or caught something early on where now it's too late. Again, with your septic field, once it clogs, it's too late. So go through the class. If you have questions, you can email us. We answer everybody's emails. And it's really a lot more detail than we're providing today. And it gives you a lot of good background information on why it's important for you to understand your well and be a good steward of your well and your aquifer, because other people typically depend on the same water supply you do. For each lesson, there's a series of additional documents under the resource library. Like the first lesson is called The Science of Groundwater. It's 8 to 10 pages long, but then we also include all of these links to these other documents that also help explain all the same concepts. And they're worth looking at. A lot of them are really useful. And so, and some of the figures that are actually in our lessons come from these documents. It may be that the way we've written the class doesn't resonate with you. It's not clear. These are a good source to look at it from somebody else's point of view. Again, we do webinars every month. This is from May 2020, groundwater and well construction. It covers more of those issues. I mentioned, the last time we did this was in October of 2020. We actually had USDA on the call because USDA has one of the few national programs that deal with providing resources for well owners. It's usually income based, and it's low income folks who are eligible for that funding. But if you are or know someone who is, and they have well problems, there may be a source through USDA. And you can watch this entire webinar, and we talk about a lot more than just funding for private well construction or repair. Some of those programs also allow you to add treatment or take care of your septic system. There's local programs depending on what state and area you live in. I know in Illinois, not every year, but most years, our soil and water conservation districts have a cost share program for abandoning wells, where maybe it's $1,000 to abandon an old well. They'll cost share half of it. So instead it costs you $500 and they pay $500, and you get your well filled in, your old well that's in the backyard or in the behind the barn that somebody's eventually going to fall in and get hurt. Okay. We do specific webinars on topics like lead. The last time we did this is in 2018. Everything you need to know about lead is in this as a private well owner. Again, this is a premise plumbing issue in most of the country. There are a few areas where the water is fairly corrosive. The pH is really low, and even your components on your pump or your drop pipe could be adding lead to your water. I know that's the case. The Piedmont Aquifer in Virginia is a low pH and corrosive, and so they see there that there's even water from the well shows lead, not because it's in the groundwater formation, but it's because it's leaching from the pipes that are in the well. And so it's really worth going through if you have lead pipes or an older home that may have lead solder and those things. And again, I mentioned the septic one. We do these every July. We do this once a year. The septic systems aren't our primary goal here. It's water quality in wells, and so obviously they play a part in that. There's also, it says 16 up here in the right corner, but there's 19 now, I believe, of these little 4 to 6 minute videos about a specific topic. What do I do after a flood? Why does my well keep losing pressure? What's a bedrock aquifer? Blah, blah, blah. And so they're short. The one on how does my pressure tank work has been the most popular video. It's had nearly 400,000 views in the last 4 or 5 years. It tells us a lot of people have water pressure problems that are on private wells, which I understand and empathize with because I did as a kid as well. So it's really, our whole class is about these things. Understand your well log and where your water's coming from. So you need to know the depth of the well, where your pump's set, do you have a screen or not, how much casing do you have, all those things matter. If there are any naturally occurring contaminants or water quality issues with your water source or where your water's coming from in your well, and then it'll help you learn to ask better questions when you do have issues with your well, if you've got good background knowledge, and that's what this class does for you. So, and then again, to reiterate, sample your well. That's really the best thing you can do to understand your water quality and understand where issues might be coming from. So our goal really is to help well owners understand why their well's important, why they need to understand how it works, and how they can help protect themselves from risk. And I forgot to change this slide. It says many of the 40+ questions you all asked when registered are answered in the class lessons. There are 80 some questions today. Certainly a number of them were. I didn't, this particular webinar before had a lot of questions that were just straight basically from our lessons. And yeah, there's a lot of good information there if you just take the class. So we do have a lot of questions today. And again, Katie is monitoring the chat and the question boxes on your GoToWebinar window. If you have a question that's come up and we don't answer it now, you can always ask that, and then we'll go through those at the end for as long as folks want to hang around. So the first one, when is chlorinating your well a good idea? Well, you should only disinfect your well when it needs it. So that's determined by sampling that shows there's bacteria. You shouldn't do it once a year. You shouldn't do it once a month, pour a cup of bleach down your well. I've heard all these stories. You should really follow an approach that's that works. So the idea when you chlorinate your well is you're not just chlorinating the well, you're chlorinating your entire water system. So you first mix up chlorine based on the size of your well and how much water is in it to get a certain concentration, say around 300 parts per million. You don't want it more than that because chlorine's an oxidant and it can leach metals. And if it can also be harmful to your well components, it can start stripping stuff off of your pump and that sort of thing. So again, Minnesota Department of Health has this guide called Well and Water System Disinfection for Private Wells. You can find it on our website under those class lessons where all the extra links were in the resource library. Under lesson 10 for water treatment solutions, there's a link to this document. But you only want to chlorinate your well when you've identified a bacteria problem, right? That's the only time to do that. So this is just one of the pages. It's got pictures, it's got tables, it tells you, like it even says warning here, if it hasn't been disinfected for many years, it could have scale buildup or even biofilm buildup. And so it could cause other kinds of issues, but that's, what you're dealing with if you haven't done that. It talks about what to take offline, all those things. And once you've shot chlorinated your well, you run water all the way through your house, through every opening, every spigot, every shower, every toilet, every sink. You let it sit overnight, and the chlorine in the water should kill any bacteria that are in your system. Sometimes that bacteria is built up, and if there are layers like that, when you chlorinate it the first time, you might kill the upper layer, but there probably isn't enough chlorine there to actually kill all of it. So, because chlorine gets used up when it's doing its work, right? And so you might have to do it a second time sometimes. And that's just the way it is. It could also be that there's a continuous source. Maybe you have a shallow well and it turns out to be the situation in the picture, like with the EPA diagram, where your septic is contributing to your well directly. If that's the case, there's not a lot you can do about that other than to put in a new well or add continuous disinfection. So that's recognizing that there's a problem with bacteria in my water. It's always going to be there. So I'm going to add chlorination or UV, and I'm going to make sure the water I'm drinking has been treated. And that's what you're doing. You're treating it by killing the bacteria. And you can do that chlorine or UV, or there's other approaches as well. And the other thing to understand about chlorine is above a pH of 8, it's not as effective. It isn't as much of a disinfectant. And so there's not a lot you can do about that. We're waiting on some research through Virginia Tech and Northeastern University to look for better guidance on what to do there, because you might need to use an alternate approach. I know you can find online places where they talk about lowering the pH of the water That would really take a lot of chemistry work to really understand if you're doing the right amount, getting things where they need to be. And so it's a slippery slope, if you will, for a typical well owner to try to deal with all that. And so, and one other thing is you may need to use a higher dose. Depending on your chemistry, there might be things in the water that react with chlorine. It is an oxidant. And so whenever you do disinfect your well and if you shock chlorinate it, you know, what I did when we did my parents is we run every tap until we smell chlorine, then we turn it off. Well, it could be that you run the water a long time and you don't ever smell chlorine, and that means you needed to use a higher dose because something's reacting with the chlorine and it's not able to do what it's supposed to do. Those are just some considerations. And again, we had a number of questions. What are the yearly maintenance steps for wells? What are steps or considerations we should take if we're unfamiliar with wells? You know, if you haven't, take our class. It's free, it's self-paced. It provides a lot more details than we can put in here. And you know, what I try to do is some of the questions I get every time, and a bunch of questions, a bunch of the same questions, like about shock chlorination. I've answered that probably on almost every webinar, but I continue to do it because we have new folks every time who are participating, and there's a lot of people asking, okay? But there are other questions that we don't get that often that I've answered before, and you can get to those by looking at those past videos of our webinars. You can find a lot of these answers to your questions. Like this one, how do I get rid of sulfur? There were 3 or 4 questions about sulfur, so I went ahead and included it. So the smell you smell is hydrogen sulfide, smells like rotten eggs, and it's either because you have bacteria in your well, either sulfate or iron reducing bacteria that are causing that, or it could be that there's actually just reactions occurring in the bedrock, if it's a bedrock aquifer, where there's natural occurring, or it's just there, and that's the tougher one. So chlorination is the best way to get rid of the bacteria, if that's what the case is. It'll kill it, and it should oxidize the gas present to eliminate the odor. It could be that, you know, those things are ubiquitous, if you will, in groundwater. They're just very common, and so it may be that if you have a substantial problem with iron or sulfate reducing bacteria, that you need to add continuous chlorination to get rid of it and to keep it away. And that's just, you know, water quality is not fair or equal everywhere, and that's you know, and like iron bacteria, they form a slime layer, the biofilms you hear about. They can harbor other bacteria within that, so they're really not a great idea to have there. You know, yeah, and so that's enough there, I think. But, you know, Minnesota Department of Health, as well as several other extension folks, have a really good document available if you just Google it. Why does my water smell like rotten eggs? You can get a more detailed response. What are the most important tests? So that was the whole question. So I took this opportunity to say, you know, we already went over what the general recommendations are, but it's really important to understand your surroundings and the area and everything else relative to your well, so you know if there's might be other issues. If your well is properly constructed and the geology is such that there's a barrier from the surface to where your water is coming in. So the example I'll give here is, let's say you have a 200-foot deep sand and gravel well. Sand and gravel wells are finished in a sand and gravel aquifer. They have a screen at the bottom. Let's say it's a 5-foot screen. All the water is coming in that well from 195 to 200 feet below land surface. That's the only place it can get in. It's solid pipe everywhere else, okay? So if you have a lot of clay or a lot of topsoil, or it's material that's not considered an aquifer above that 195 feet, then it's much less likely that stuff from the surface is going to make its way down and get in your well and get in that aquifer. Versus the well I grew up on, which was hand dug, water from it was uncemented brick, so water could come in at 2 inches below land surface, underneath, you know, through the soil. Not protective at all, probably always contaminated. And so you need to understand your well construction and what kind of geology you have to know whether that's an issue. The other side of that is the same 200-foot bedrock well might not have 200 feet of casing. You know, bedrock doesn't provide water. Cracks in the rock provide water. So when you drill a bedrock well, you only put the casing into the rock a little way, and then the rest of it's an open hole so that those fractures can be part of your well. And so it depends on how much casing there is, how protected it is from the surface. I've run into wells that are 300 feet deep, but they only have 15 feet of casing because bedrock's at the surface. That's not protective. You know, some of those fractures and fissures in the rock could come up to the surface, and it might be surface water that's actually getting into your well all the way down, you know, at whatever depth. But you might have fractures all along the way, and all of them contribute to the well. So it's about understanding your geology and well construction, as well as knowing what to test for. And then again, if your well is poorly constructed, then it's much more of a problem. And I'd say where this question comes up most of the time is related to pesticides. Our backyard backs up to a farm field. How concerned should I be? Well, if you have the first case, a properly constructed sand and gravel well that's 200 feet deep and it's mostly clay for the upper 150 feet, I wouldn't be concerned at all. Very, very little chance. But if it's an old dug well or a bedrock's really shallow and it's a bedrock well, then you need to understand how much casing you have, how much overburden soil there is, what type of material it is, whether it's sandy or if it's more clayey. All those things matter. And then what's nearby? You know, is there livestock? Is there a field? Is there a gas station? Yeah, most importantly then again is also check with professionals for natural contaminants of concern. I mentioned New Hampshire has arsenic and Rhode Island has beryllium. We talked about that earlier. But there's folks who understand if there's naturally occurring contaminants in your area, and you should lean on them. So quickly, these are properly constructed bored wells. So the one on the left is concrete tile, there's a concrete cap, and there's cement for the first 10 feet or so around the outside of it, and then it's sand. So each of those pieces of concrete tile are 4-foot sections, and they're not cemented together. They're just set on top of each other. They have a male end and a female end, if you will. And so water comes in at those seams. So if that concrete wasn't there in the upper 10 feet and that well was a foot above land surface, which is showing 8-inch minimum there, then water could come in at about 3 feet. That's not very protective. Now the way it is, it's at least 10 feet, maybe more. And the picture on the right is another version of that bored well where they actually put the concrete cap down at 10 feet. And they filled that in. It says clean earth fill, but it should be clay material that doesn't allow water through. And then you only have a 4 to 6 inch pipe coming up to the surface, so it looks like a normal well. But these are properly constructed. You know, my old dug well is old uncemented brick lined up around in a circle around the well, the outside of the well, where water can seep in anywhere. Versus a sand and gravel well, I already talked about that. It has a screen at the bottom, so your depth really, usually a private well only has less than 10 feet, usually less than 5 feet of screen because you don't need more than that. It's in sand and gravel. Everything else is solid pipe all the way to the surface, and it's sealed. So water can only get in through the screen. And so understanding where the screen is probably the most important thing, because then you know the depth at which water's coming in your well. And the log would have the geology of what you encountered as they drilled through that material to get to that sand and gravel aquifer, versus a bedrock well. Again, if you look at this diagram, it says 10 to 20 feet of casing into bedrock on the right side, right below the blue soil overburden. So you seep the well into the bedrock, and then the rest of that is just an open hole. So you're drilling a hole through rock, and you're hoping to hit fractures, like those blue lines are the bedrock fractures. If you hit no fractures, you have no water. Water doesn't exist in rock itself, right? It's solid. It exists in the fractures in the bedrock. And so depending on where those fractures go, they might head right back up to the surface. So a 200-foot bedrock well, same 200 feet depth, if it only has 30 feet of steel casing, it's not nearly as protective. Water can get in the well from 30 feet on down in that case, right? So that's what you really need to understand about your well. So what do I do if there's radon in my water? So radon, you know, you get it mostly by inhaling it is why it's a problem. They find it in basements, right, where it's whatever. But if you Google basic information about radon in drinking water, there's an EPA page. It's actually in their archives. It's not active anymore, but they left it up because it's got good information. They say that there's about 168 cases of cancer death per year from radon in drinking water. So that's not a lot, but 89% of those are actually by breathing the radon that's coming out of the water when you open up a tap, and 11% is coming from drinking it. So 11% of 168 is 17 people or so. So most of it's still because of the inhalation issue. But you can treat your water. Getting it tested is a little tricky. If you want to get your water tested for radon, you need to talk to a lab that does that work. And because it gets released and it's got a short half-life, it volatilizes whenever you bring it out of the ground. You have to collect it in an inverted bottle, and there's a special bottle for that and all that. But to treat it, it does come out of solution whenever you bring it up to atmospheric pressure, because water's under higher pressure in the ground, so you can aerate it. So if you put in an aeration tank or a settling tank and pump your water into that settling tank and then have a vent for that goes outside, hopefully at elevation, like above the lip of the roof of your house, all that volatilized radon will go up and out through your house. Then you have to have a second pump to pump into your pressure tank from the settling tank. It'll also, that's what you use for methane. Because you're introducing it to air in the settling tank, if you have iron or manganese or some other things, the same aeration is going to cause those to precipitate out and form iron oxide or manganese dioxide, or manganese oxide, I think. So there is a way to treat it. I also found that you can treat it with granular activated carbon. That would be like a cartridge filter probably. And that to me is problematic for a private well owner, because one thing I did read is that cartridge can then become radioactive for a given amount of time, which you don't want to be handling or be around. And to try to use GAC for your whole house, because remember, if it's coming out of the water when it comes out your tap, that means you need to have it before your showers, before your toilets, before every sink in the house. All those things, again, is problematic. I think it would be really expensive. I don't know enough about granular activated carbon on a house scale, but you also you'll have that carbon eventually is going to get used up, right? It's going to have all that stuff on it, because it's also going to collect other things. It removes odor and taste and a lot of other things. And so you're going to have to dispose of that. And it seems like not the best way to go to me, but I am not a treatment professional. I know aeration works though, and for that and a number of things. So this is a great question, just because someone's humorous here. My well's 300 plus feet deep. If we lose electricity, what, if any, are my options? Die of thirst, pray for rain. Hopefully no, it doesn't come to that. So in general, every well has a pump, and without electricity, you cannot pump water. And I say that because I've been asked a number of times, what do I do when my electricity goes out? You don't have access to your water because your pump needs electricity. So what we recommend to anyone in a rural area or that has issues with electricity going out, I grew up on a farm. We had an ice storm in 1976 when I was a kid, and we went without power for 7 days. We had a generator. We plugged into our power pole where our power came in. We could change the power to this generator, and it ran our home. And that's what I recommend. Now they have really fancy generators that run once a month, and they're automatic and all that stuff. Those are pretty pricey. I don't know how much they cost, but if you live in a rural area, I can imagine they're really valuable to have. So that's one thing you can do, is just have backup power. And if you're again in a really rural area, it's worth exploring. I think right now, I know they're really hard to get. More people have been home. People are moving into more remote areas. I think COVID's really changed the attitude of a lot of Americans. And so the generator business is actually one that's really been successful because of that. You can also have a tank. You could have someone bring out a tank, like a community sometimes offer a service where they'll bring a tank full of water. If you're going to do that, you'd have to have a pump connected to it so you keep water pressure in your home. I would not use that for my drinking water anyway, even if it's potable water, because unless you've really taken care of that tank and made sure it's been disinfected, I wouldn't trust that those lines don't eventually get bacteria or some kind of something like that on them. I would still try to use bottled water for drinking and cooking if you're going to do that, but it would give you water to flush your toilets, all those sorts of things. And I bring up at the bottom, when we were without power, we went out and used a hand pump to pump water at my grandma's. I should have put that in here because we had water so that you could flush a toilet just by filling up the back of the tank on a toilet, right? And so we did that with a hand pump and 5-gallon buckets. So when there's a will, there's a way. After a power outage, how do you know if your water is safe to drink? So it really depends on your drinking water system, which means all the pipes in your home and everything else, but it should be a closed loop, right? It should, there shouldn't be any place where things can get in. So if you have a power outage, it really shouldn't affect your water quality unless you lose pressure in your pressure tank and your pipes aren't full anymore. So if you're without power for an extended time and you've got air in your lines, it's not pressurized anymore. If there's any bacteria in the water or whatever, they're gonna grow, they're gonna form a biofilm, and honestly, I think if we could tear down every private water system, including all the pipes in a home, we'd find many that have some sort of biofilm or bacteria in some places. It doesn't necessarily show up in a sample. It may be a biofilm that's iron bacteria, for instance, that it's not coliform, it's not hazardous, and so because there are other types of bacteria that exist in groundwater that are not a problem for public health, and so they're not a concern, but the air in the lines would certainly make this a bigger problem. So the thing to do is, if that happens and you know that your water pressures, you've turned on a tap and it's spitting air, then once your system's pressurized again, it'd be worthwhile to get it tested before you drink it, just to make sure. Build a new house, but kept the same well that is many years old. Initially, water was fine, but now has a metallic smell, but no iron stains. What's the deal? Well, water with iron in it doesn't have a metallic smell. And I was interested in this because usually it's a metallic taste if it's copper. I've not run across a metallic smell. That may be just me. And so, but what it could mean is that if you have copper pipes especially, that your water is a little bit corrosive and you're leaching metal from your pipes. And so the thing to do is to test regardless, right? And I asked, do you have copper pipes? What type of pipes do you have? What pipes were in the old house? Maybe the old house was something different. You didn't have it happen there. I don't think it could be a change because it's got to be because of the new pipes, not anything else. I couldn't think of what else it might be. But I would have your kitchen tap water analyzed for metals and inorganics and the things we mentioned earlier, right, in that list, just so that you can see if there's a reason. If there's a taste, there's a reason. That's one of the recommendations we have is if your water tastes funny, get it tested. And so if you have already done that, you're welcome to send me the results and we can take a look. But if we had sample results, we'd certainly be able to give you a better idea if it's one of those things. And also what kind of pipes you have. You said your house was only 3 years old, I think, which means it should be after all the lead-free stuff was done, so there shouldn't be a lead problem at all, because there should be no lead solder or lead fittings that could cause that, lead in any of the fittings. So, but it seems like it might be a corrosion issue. And maybe it was there before, and ideally, to explain this, you had PVC or PEX pipes before, plastic pipes, and that's why you didn't have that. And now that you have metal pipes, you're seeing it. That's the recommendation on the other side. If you can't, your water's corrosive and you can't do anything else about it, you could replace your pipes and put in PVC or PEX, and then you're not going to PEX, and then you're not going to have that metal leaching because there's no metal to leach per se. Arsenic, manganese, and nitrate. What are the best filtration systems for arsenic and or manganese? And do these systems work for nitrate? So this is a multi-slide answer here. And so I'm not sure what the best is. I wasn't sure if you meant by company or that sort of thing, which we can't recommend. Again, what I'd recommend is you use one that's ANSI, NSF, or NSF ANSI certified to remove those things. But water chemistry is complicated and water treatment is too. And so you really need to do your homework. And so I'm just going to talk about arsenic because it exists in 2 oxidation states, +3 and +5. And the more oxidized state is better removed by either a filter or by RO. And so if your arsenic is +3, or even if you're not sure, most labs don't test for one or the other, then you want to chlorinate or aerate so that you've changed it to the +5 state. I think I have that right. I'm not a chemist. So that the treatment will be more effective. Sometimes, like RO doesn't work as well on the less oxidized state of arsenic. And I'm not sure why that's the case, but I know that's true. And so and then there's other things like if you have sulfate, or what was the other thing? There's another things that can affect how treatment will work in removing arsenic, just because you can have competing ions, and some things take up all those, the reaction sites, if you will. And so you may need to put a filter in front of it or do other things. And so it's not a simple thing like, well, if we put RO on it, it's going to work. You just put RO on it to remove arsenic, you may find that you didn't remove any. And then you may think that the RO didn't work. Well, it's because it's in the wrong state and you really have to oxidize it first, and blah, 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 blah. And also sometimes you can have the opposite. We looked at all of the samples that contained arsenic from our lab. This is in the early 2000s. I looked at about 100 sample results where they gave us both a raw water sample, which was the natural groundwater sample from like an outside spigot before they tested, or before any treatment or went through their home plumbing, and then one from the kitchen tap. And for those that had arsenic in both places, or a high enough arsenic in the raw water, I looked at what kind of treatment they had, and what was making it effective. And what we learned is that, and this was already known, but what we learned, two things. The big thing we learned is that sometimes even your water softener will remove arsenic because it's removing iron and it co-precipitates. And so if you're using an iron filter, so it oxidizes the iron first and then it filters out the iron oxide, arsenic will also co-precipitate with that. And so we see arsenic removal even though we're trying to remove arsenic or manganese in those cases. So I said here, Google MN for Minnesota, home water treatment. They just put out, I think last year, maybe 2 years ago, an excellent document that describes every constituent and every kind of treatment that works on that constituent. So I'm going to show you a couple screenshots of that. It's really worth having in your pocket, especially if you're going to add treatment. You don't want a treatment that's not going to be effective, so you need to make sure it's certified, but also certain types of treatment only work on certain things. So this is the document and that's the URL. But again, if you Google Minnesota home water treatment, when you do that in Google, you get 4 or 5 ads first. And then the first 2 things that come up are the 1-page version of this document and then the 8-page version. And so the second link for me was this document on home water treatment. And so it walks you through things. It has the symbols here on the first page: NSF, water quality for their gold seal, or UL certified for water quality. Your treatment device should have one of those symbols on it for the constituents you're trying to remove. And I would not buy one that doesn't have at least one of those. And that's typical. They go through one certifier. So on the second or third page, you see this list of all the constituents on the left side, and on the top is a list of all the types of common treatment that will work. And so for arsenic, I highlighted for nitrate because that was the second part of that question. For nitrate, anion exchange, distillation, or reverse osmosis. Okay, so arsenic has some others, right? It looks like all those work on arsenic as well, but they don't all work on manganese. Anion exchange doesn't work on manganese, but aeration does. Aeration and filtration, we talked about that earlier, right? And so further down this is a list of each of these types of equipment, what their pros and cons are, typical costs, and what they're designed to remove. And so I've highlighted that, manganese on the aeration and filtration side, but again, may partially remove arsenic, says at the bottom there on the second row, if there's also high iron, because it'll co-precipitate with iron. And there's 2 of these that are that way. And so it may remove arsenic as well. So it's a kind of an extra benefit. Anion exchange, I mentioned that earlier. You'd have to talk to a treatment purveyor there. When I first saw this, I thought, well, sodium chloride or potassium chloride, that's a softener. But anion exchange is different because you're actually adding that's called cation exchange, is the way my boss explained this, who's a chemist. And this is a different type of device, and I'm not honestly sure what it is, but you want an anion exchange device. I think they're used pretty commonly, but you know, everything has a price tag, as you can see. But all of this stuff is all in one document. It's 8 pages long. I just told you how to get to it. And you can use this, and you should have this in your pocket. When you're talking to a treatment specialist, if they're trying to sell you, you know, $6,000 worth of equipment, tell them, no, this is what I need. I need an aerator to remove this, because I want to get rid of the manganese and iron in my system, you know, or whatever it might be. So yeah, and this is really nice because it includes point of use and point of entry. And you know, I've read where some people put point of entry RO. I have not run across a situation where that was necessary. You are wasting so much money if you try to RO your entire house, and you're wasting so much water. You know, RO is a 5-to-1 deal. You waste 5 gallons for every gallon that you clean. And look at the difference in price between a point of use, which would be at your kitchen tap, and a point of entry. You know, I asked the Minnesota Department of Health if 250 ppb of arsenic would be dangerous for somebody in their shower. It's not. You know, it's drinking it. That's the risk, not in your shower. It'd have to be super high where it's going to affect your skin in order to be a problem, which we don't see typically in groundwater. So I'm going to go ahead and skip this. Well, I guess I talked earlier about collecting 2 samples, and I'm just going to show you this really quickly. I realize I've run pretty long. We suggest typically, so the question was, what's the best way to test your water? We suggest, and this, you know, again, it's not for everyone, it costs more money, obviously, is that you collect 2 samples, one from an outside tap that's before any kind of treatment and straight from the well if you can, and then one from an inside tap, preferably your kitchen tap where you're getting your drinking water. So when you collect the drinking water sample first, and then you go outside and turn on a spigot and let it run for a while until your pump kicks on. Now the water coming out of your spigot is groundwater straight from your well that hasn't been sitting in the well but being pulled in by pumping. So now we have a groundwater sample. We know what the raw groundwater was, and we have a drinking water sample, which is what you're drinking and is important for your health. And if you do 2 of those, you're going to see a lot of differences, typically, especially if you have any kind of treatment, a filter or you know, even RO or a softener. They change the chemistry, and you're going to see those differences. So here's an example of that. This is these are all samples from 2015. This person has a filter and a softener and also an RO unit, and they took samples. This one's from outside, and you can see the sodium's 25.9. The turbidity is pretty high. The color, there's got color to it because it's natural groundwater. The pH is 8.2, and the hardness is 351. Okay, so after their filter and softener, now the sodium went up from in the 20s to 198 because they're using sodium salt in their softener. Well, that's an issue if you're on a low sodium diet and you drink a lot of water, and so you might want to use potassium chloride instead. But look what it did to everything else. It lowered the hardness to 0.68 from 351. It changed the pH a little bit, but it certainly lowered the turbidity and color, which you'd expect it to. You're taking out things that are making it, giving it color and causing it to be turbid. So then after their RO unit, though, you know, everything's less than. That's what those arrows mean. It's below detection limit. And so you've taken out everything in the water, including the buffering that keeps the pH high. And so now the pHs went down to 6.23. So here's where that whole house RO comes into play. If you have lowered your pH such that now your water is a little corrosive and now you're running it through your house, you might be causing other problems, lead, copper, metals release, that you wouldn't have had because your water was 8 coming in. And so there's unintended consequences to everything you do. I would not use a whole house RO unless you have a really good reason, and I'd get a second opinion if someone recommends it. Because I've not ran across a case where it's really necessary. And I know I've also ran across some treatment vendors who said, oh, we install those all the time. And it's done out of fear, not out of, you know, what's best for your home or science. And so, yeah, that's all I'll say there. So if you go to webinars and events under the private well class, and you'll get this page, you can see the webinar today, November 18th, and the two we have coming up. One is really just for EHPs, environmental health professionals. And then you can see all the recent ones we've had in the past, going back to the septic system one in July. You click on recording, it takes you to our YouTube page, or to a page where you can get to our YouTube page, and you can watch all those. And again, there's questions like the ones we just answered, but different in some cases, in most cases, that are useful. So that's what I have on our slide deck. So it looks like we do have a number of questions that people have asked. So if you'll hang on, I'll pull those over. I have to, hopefully, Katie, tell me if you're seeing this.
Yeah, I can see it.
And I need to make this larger quick. Okay, is that big enough?
Yep, I can read it good. Thanks.
So what impacts should we be aware of for farming with weed controls and fertilizers, and how should we monitor, and when would be the best times for those tests to be conducted? I don't know that it's a seasonal thing, and pesticides have changed a lot in the last 25 years. I know we did a lot of work looking at pesticides and fertilizers in the 90s, where you're still using a lot of atrazine and allichlor and some other things. As far as it really comes down to how close to your well, and again, as I mentioned in that example, what type of well do you have? Where's your water coming from? What do you know about the well casing? Is it a sand and gravel well or bedrock well or an old dug well? I would say that what we found in doing that study in the 90s is that by far old hand dug wells were the most contaminated. And then it varied by depth to aquifer. So shallower wells were more susceptible than deeper wells. So it really does hold true, and we have research to prove it. We were doing that study though at the time to help verify non-point source pollution. A lot of these things now today are just there. There's areas where every water sample you collect from a shallow well in a given farming area is going to have nitrate. The background we assume is around 3 parts per million, I think. And now it's, the standard is 10, and we may find it at 6 or 8 in a lot of places. And so that's just the way it is because of all the use. But whether that gets into your well or not, again, depends on how deep your well is, where the water's coming from, how protected at the surface it is. I know in that same study, we looked at different depths to aquifer, and we actually found an aquifer that was below 150 feet of till, which is why I use that as an example, where there were no coliform problems, and the nitrate values were all around 3 or less. And that's what we'd expect in natural groundwater without any ag contribution. So I don't know that seasonally when it's the best time, right after, you certainly see more in the spring probably, just because it's wetter, there's more infiltration. So a shallow well would probably be at the highest levels. We've seen both cases. We've seen areas where it's pretty consistent throughout the year, and we've also seen where it is seasonal, I guess, especially for nitrate. And so, but farming practices have changed. Not everybody applies in the fall anymore like they used to, some of those things. That's the best answer I have for you. Our house used to use our well water. The property was annexed by the nearby city and was required to be tied to the municipal water supply. In the event of long-term service outage, how difficult is it to reconnect our well? Well, today anyway, I'm sure that you signed an agreement not to ever use your well, because that would potentially provide a cross-contamination backflow issue for the community water supply. So I don't think that's an option. You'd have to have a whole separate set of pipes, all those things, in order to have a water system hooked up to your well. Now I know, especially when some of the rural water systems went in, 25 years ago again, you had the option to keep your well for, your livestock or your garden or whatever. Most of the time that's not allowed anymore because people cheated. They hooked it up to their water supply and they caused backflow problems and affected municipal water supply water. That's got to be a closed system by law. So it should be very difficult, and you shouldn't do it. It's and if this is the question that I answered earlier, I didn't realize, I guess I didn't understand the question that well when you're talking about the new home. How do you find info about your well? So the best thing to do is your state well logs, water well logs. And that's one of the lessons in our class lessons, lesson 7, is just about how to find local information. Because people, everyone needs to be inquisitive about their well. Most states have records. Some have them online. You can go on our state geological survey's website. There's a map. You can zoom into your area, find your well if it's there, if we have a log for it. In some states you have to request it. Some states it's a county or local jurisdiction that holds that. A few states don't have very good records. I know I didn't want to pick on New York. They had a great health department, but they didn't pass a law until 2000 that required wells to be filed, or well logs to be filed. And so if you think about that, every well before 2000 was installed in New York State, and no logs were filed, or very few. So they found that they probably had maybe 10% of the well logs on file of the actual wells in use. And they found an inventive way through their tax records to at least figure out if a property had a well or not. And they found over 800,000 wells that way. And so they know there's a well there, but they don't have any of the information, geology or whatever. And what I would recommend in any of those situations, or if you can't find your log, is see what logs might be in the same, within a mile of you. And if you're in a really remote area, that's not going to help. But in a lot of the country, you have neighbors within a quarter mile, half mile, whatever, maybe their log's on file, and it might not tell you everything about your well, but you can always, if you're in that situation, the next time you have a well problem, or you have to have your pump worked on or whatever, while they've already pulled the pump, if it's a submersible, I would have them measure the depth and figure out then through geologic maps or through your state geological survey if your well's likely bedrock or sand and gravel if they don't know, but likely a contractor who's in the area will know. There's a lot of things you can try to do, and in the end, in some cases, you're just not going to have that information, and that's just the unfortunate truth about that. But there's a lot of ways to look for that stuff. If you Google, for instance, if you Google Missouri water well logs, the first link that comes up is Missouri DNR, which is the agency in the state of Missouri that keeps all the well logs. And if you did that in Illinois, you'd see links for both the Geological Survey and the State Water Survey, which we have all those here in files. And I can pull them up on a little program I have. When somebody calls me, I can look in their area and pull up a log for either their well or a neighboring well, within a couple minutes. So the next question, we have no information about our well. Do we need to dig down to see it to understand its depth and other general information? The pump is in our basement. Okay, so if you have a contractor come out, if your pump's in your basement, it means it's either a suction pump, which means it has one line going to the well, which means likely the water level has to be less than 25 feet or so, or it's a jet pump with 2 lines going down into the well, and then it could be any depth. And so a contractor can probably tell you that for one. And then again, if you take the cap off, a contractor, you could ask them to measure the depth. They may know more about your well. If you don't know how deep your well is, it might be worth contacting a few local drillers. If they didn't drill your well, they may know if one of their competitors did. It takes some work. I know when we were doing a study where we were looking at all the wells in 9 townships in a rural area, there's still 1,700 wells. And I reached out to all the active drillers after we went, and I had students go to every home and ask them about their well. And in the end, when we asked who drilled your well, we ended up with 54 names of either drilling companies or drillers that drilled these wells. Well, after talking to the local drillers who are there today, only 6 of those were still in business. And so that, in itself is a huge issue. And so we're not going to get that information. And it's just because so many wells are older. And so, but you can measure the depth. You probably want to have a professional do that. And yeah, but I know one of my colleagues has a pump in his basement, and I asked him if it was a jet pump or a suction pump, and he told me it was a suction pump. I'm like, well, then you have pretty shallow water. And it turned out he was wrong. It was a jet pump, and so his well's 116 feet deep because in the end we measured it. But you know, that's the kind of effort we had to go to there. So, but if you start talking to some of the resource agencies, they want to help you in most cases, and so they'll do a little legwork for you, especially if they see that you're really interested and you want to learn more about your well, you ask the right questions. That's how it works. Please touch on high iron solutions for well water. So I did. I think this question maybe came in earlier. Iron is a very common nuisance in well water. It stains everything, and it's usually very high. Usually you need to oxidize it and then filter it out. And there's oxidizing filters just for that. You can use that document from Minnesota Department of Health and look at other solutions. But, we certainly see even sometimes a softener, though it's not meant to, will remove some of those things too. Yeah. In a village in Alaska, we have acidic water. What do you recommend as treatment? Well, what communities do is they add phosphates. So you need to raise the pH so that it's not corrosive. And, depending, when you say village, is this a native Alaskan village or just a small village, it's out in the middle of nowhere? There is a lot of support. If it's tribal through Indian Health Service and, the state of Alaska, I can't think of the name of their organization, it's not DEP, but, they're working hard to develop well construction code, for instance, because they realize they're one of the two states that doesn't have that. And so they have some very engaged people there. And if you will send me an email, a couple hours after this webinar, you're going to get an email with my email address on it, asking if you enjoyed the webinar. And so if you want to email me back, I'm not a treatment expert, but I know that what communities do is they add phosphate, and that's typically, it raises the pH and allows scale to form on like lead pipes. So, we talk about lead problems in, like Flint, Michigan, when that happened and was discovered in 2014. There are thousands of communities in the country that have lead pipes where they don't have lead water quality issues because they're adding treatment to the water to keep it from being corrosive or aggressive. So because you have lead pipes doesn't mean you have a problem, but if you have acidic water, it definitely is an issue because that makes the water more corrosive and more aggressive. I can get you help, and I'm not clear from your question if this is a community water supply or a private well, but there's a lot of folks that we work with through our wateroperator.org program that helps small communities that I can contact on your behalf and get an answer for you. So, yeah. All right. Yeah, just email me. We should probably talk. So here's our email address. If you're looking for CEs, you can email us there. If you have any other questions, you can also email us at info@privatewellclass.org as well. Thanks for your time. I'm sorry it went so long, and appreciate everyone who hung around today. So, all right, I'm going to end this. And Katie, I will lose you when I do, but we can talk later. Thank you for your help today, and thanks everyone who attended.